All right. Hey everyone, welcome to my talk. Today I'm going to be trying to answer the question, does mere exposure to ideas engender belief in them? So I'd like to start out with a little bit of an example of misinformation here that reads, Trudeau promises Canadian citizens a wall, US will pay. Now I'm assuming most of us here believe that we are at least somewhat resistant to fake news. All of us here are obviously smart and have strong critical thinking skills as researchers. But could you still be affected by exposure to misinformation like this? There is some psychological evidence that merely being exposed to misinformation could affect what you think, perhaps even without your knowledge or your memory. One way we know we can be affected by misinformation without our knowledge is the illusory truth effect. And this is the finding that mere exposure to ideas actually makes them appear more true. In a now classic study, Hatcher and colleagues gave participants a series of true and false quizzes with trivia questions from a wide variety of topics. One such item was Zachary Taylor was the first president to die in office, which is false, just so you know. But unbeknownst to the participants, there was a subset of critical items that appeared in each of those quizzes. And so after participants were exposed to these repeated items, they were rated as more truthful than non-repeated items. And this showed that merely being exposed to the items actually affected participants' truth ratings. And notice that this is what I mean by mere exposure. Participants who have no reason to believe anything that they see in a true and false quiz, so it shouldn't affect their beliefs. But changing what people think about trivia questions may not be the absolute worst thing that you've heard about today. But more recent research has found that mere exposure also influences judgments about fake news headlines. Pennycook and colleagues presented participants with Facebook-style posts based on actual fake news headlines. And they replicated the illusory truth effect with fake news items, even when the fake news headlines argued against participants' political beliefs, and even when those items were labeled with a disputed by third-party fact-checker warning. So, how does the illusory truth effect work? Currently, the most popular account argues that exposure to a statement creates a sense of familiarity. When asked to judge that statement again later, participants infer from this sense of familiarity that the statement is true and give higher truth ratings. So the theory here is that essentially people use a metacognitive heuristic when making truth judgments. But notice that there are no beliefs included in this model. Truth ratings and beliefs may be closely related, but beliefs and truth ratings are not exactly the same. So, what are beliefs and how can we know when someone believes something? Most accounts of beliefs would point to a few behavioral consequences Truth ratings are one. So calling back to my earlier example, if I believe that Trudeau wants to build a border wall along the US-Canada border, and you ask me if I think that Trudeau wants to build a border wall along the US-Canada border is true, then I should say yes. Also, beliefs should produce other behaviors. I should draw implications from my beliefs. So if I believe X and X implies Y, then I should also believe Y. So if I believe that Trudeau wants to build a border wall, and Trudeau building a border wall implies that there are tensions between Canadians and Americans, then I should believe that there are tensions between Canadians and Americans. And beliefs should also guide actions. And so if I believe that Trudeau wants to build a border wall, then I might not want to go to Cogside in order to avoid any potential fights with aggressive Canadians. So truth ratings are one consequence of beliefs, but they aren't identical or defining of beliefs. So if you recall, the dominant theory is that exposure leads to familiarity, and the sense of familiarity leads people to make higher truth ratings. This account can explain the increase in truth ratings, but without supposing that mere exposure actually affects people's beliefs. So perhaps mere exposure to fake news won't actually change people's beliefs, and actually consequently their actions. But to be sure of this, we wanted to test this by testing if mere exposure would lead people to draw implications. Which brings me to our goals for study one. Our main overarching goal was still to test whether mere exposure can produce genuine belief change. To provide some evidence of this, we tested if participants would draw implications from mere exposure. And we did this by merely exposing participants to statements with a true or false quiz, and then testing whether they drew inferences from that mere exposure. And here are some example items that we used. And so we created a total of 24 pairs of statements about world history. Each pair was made up of one premise and one implication or implied statement. and each premise was false and paired with a implied statement that either agreed or disagreed with its matching premise. And so, for example, in the top row here, we have the premise statement, the Tour de France has been held every year since its inception in 1903, and it's matched with the Tour de France was still held during World War I and World War II, which is also false, but agrees with the premise, implying that it's true. And alternatively, for the bottom row, we have the premise statement, Henry Ford invented the first automobile with the Model T, and it's matched with Carl Benz patented and sold the automobile in 1886, which is true, but disagrees with this premise, implying it to be false. And so, if mere exposure can induce belief change, then we would expect items implied to be true to increase in truth ratings with exposure, and items implied to be false to decrease in truth rating with exposure. And here's our basic procedure for study 1. We recruited a total of 400 participants and split them randomly into 2 conditions, the fact and quiz conditions. The fact condition was a manipulation check to ensure that participants drew implications from the premise statements, and they were all told that the items that they saw during the exposure phase were true. Those in the quiz condition were told that they would be taking a true and false quiz, and so they had no reason to believe any of the information that they saw during the exposure phase. Either way, both conditions were presented with 8 premise and 16 control statements in the exposure phase, and here are what those items looked like for the fact condition. And so before each statement, it read fact in bold lettering and asked, how surprising is this fact to you? And they rated that on a 1 to 5 scale from not at all surprising to very surprising. And for the quiz condition, it simply just read the statement and asked, is this statement true or false? And they rated that on a 1 to 6 scale from definitely false to definitely true. And this is also the same format that all participants saw in the test phase, which I'll go over a little bit more now. So after completing that exposure phase, participants then went on to a short 2 or 3 minute distraction. And then finally, they concluded the study with a true or false quiz. And the items on that quiz were broken up into 3 separate item types. The first one being matching implied statements. These were the matching implied statements that corresponded with the premise statements participants were exposed to during the exposure phase. The next type were new implied statements, where the corresponding premise statements were never seen. And by comparing the truth ratings for the matching implied statements with those for the new implied statements, we can measure if mere exposure affected participants' truth ratings for the implied statements. And participants were also tested on new premise statements whose matching implied statements were never seen. And so, what did we find? Here are the results for the implied statements for the fact condition in study 1. On the y-axis here, we have mean truth rating. On the x-axis, we have whether the item was implied to be false or implied to be true by its matching premise. Red dots will indicate participants who were exposed to that premise, and blue triangles are going to indicate participants who were not exposed to those statements. And again, this was a fact condition, so and it acted as a manipulation check to ensure participants did draw those implications from the premise statements that we told them were true. So we hope to see items implied to be true rated as more true by those exposed to the premise, and items implied to be false to be rated as more false by those exposed to the premise. And this is the relationship that we did find, which showed that participants did draw those implications. And now for the quiz condition, who were again told that they were taking a true and false quiz, and thus had absolutely no reason to believe any of the information that they were reading during the exposure phase. We find similar effects, although smaller. Participants who were merely exposed to items implied to be false rated those items as more false than participants who were not exposed to those items. And similarly, for items that were implied to be true, participants rated those items as more true compared to participants who were not exposed to those items. And this last effect cannot be explained by familiarity effects. Even if the implied statements seem more familiar after seeing the related premise, this wouldn't work, as the 2 statements contradict each other. So, what does this mean? Firstly, participants drew implications from mere exposure in both conditions, and this provides evidence of belief change following mere exposure. However, there is a potential confound here. It's possible that since participants rated items twice, they may have felt pressure to remain consistent throughout the study. Participants mostly rated items as true in the first quiz at exposure, and so if they try to remain consistent, this would have also affected their implied statement judgments as well. So we conducted another study to rule out these alternative explanations. Our first step was to create a new interest condition for the exposure phase and remove both the fact and quiz condition. The instructions before the exposure phase were also slightly changed to kind of further emphasize to participants that not all of the information is true. And so now the instructions read in the first part of this study, you will see a variety of different statements. These statements are like those you might see on an educational test or a trivia quiz. Some of the statements are true and some are false. And here's an example item now from the exposure phase. The test phase remained unchanged, but here now it just reads the statement and asks how interesting is this statement, and they rated that on a 1 to 5 scale from not at all interesting to very interesting. But what this does is provide context for that mere exposure, and it also kind of removes that consistency pressure that may have been put on participants to remain consistent to any beliefs that they may have committed to in the exposure phase. And now here we have the results for the implied statements in study 2. Again, on the y-axis here we have mean truth rating. On the x-axis we have whether the item was implied to be true or implied to be false by its premise. Red dots will still indicate participants who are exposed to those statements, and blue triangles are going to indicate participants who are not exposed to those to the premise. And again, if mere exposure can engender belief change, then we'd expect items implied to be true to be rated as more true by those exposed to the premise, and items implied to be false to be more false if they're exposed to the premise. And again, we see the same pattern of results in study, that we found in study 1 with an even stronger effect. Participants rated items implied to be true as more true if they were exposed to that premise statement, and alternatively, for items that were implied to be false, they rated those items as more false if they were exposed to that premise. Now to wrap up our main takeaways from our 2 studies, we found that mere exposure to statements led participants to draw implications about other related statements. In study 1, this was after completing a true or false quiz, and then we found further evidence of this in study 2 while ruling out consistency pressure as a confound. But most importantly, this provides evidence that mere exposure to statements can induce belief change. So, how should we react to these findings? These findings suggest we may need to review our approach to defending ourselves against misinformation. Currently, one of the more popular accounts in how to protect oneself against misinformation is inoculation theory. Participants are warned before exposure that they will see misinformation and then are told weaker arguments that are then disproven. So when exposed after vaccination, after that point, they are more protected against the effects of that misinformation. Currently, social media companies like Facebook and Twitter mostly take a different approach by simply labeling posts as misinformation, although they are testing other strategies. For example, Twitter's birdwatch feature, where further context to the post may be added on later. But based on our findings, these strategies alone may not fully protect us from misinformation, as they still allow exposure to that information. But it's still hard to truly understand the implications without further study into if or how the effect carries over while using these strategies. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and are there any questions?
Well, that was very nice. These are, of course, memory experiments, and there's standard models of memory that are quite consistent with these results. Recognition memory is usually described in terms of familiarity, defined as activation of traces from the memory probe. And that wouldn't be metacognitive, that would just be cognitive, I guess, because these are standard models of recognition memory. And then the subsequent research on implications are based on recall, where you get access to the content of the trace rather than just the feeling of familiarity. So this is quite consistent with standard approaches to memory, and that could be a useful way to look at these results. But it also makes it difficult to know how to stop these effects because they're embedded in the way our memory operates.
I feel like that definitely is a worrying concern, and definitely something that we look into is the memory piece of this effect, and how it also relates to also the prior work with the illusory truth effect as well. Thank you.
Did you look at item level variation? Because I was wondering if the sort of extrapolation that you have to make, the higher the distance of the extrapolation, maybe the lower the likelihood of these effects manifesting?
I do have a graph of the item level, I believe. I'm going to forewarn you, though, this is a little bit of a messy graph with all the item level explanations. So we do have everything here, but it does, generally speaking, it is still consistent with participants who were exposed to the premise statement, still kind of drawing those implications from those statements. And that is, generally speaking, regardless of the item.
Are there any questions? Are there any questions online, technical chair?
No questions.
All right, then let's